Welcome to the Product Clinic. I'm very happy to present you today a new guest. This is Victor Steininger, a product manager that we talk today about his experience in Medtech product management in B2B sales. So I'm very happy to have Victor today. Victor is a dear friend of me. We studied at the same place at EPFL, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And also, surprisingly, we decided to take a similar career in product management. So he has extensive experience that he will talk about today. Additionally, he was also co-founding a startup, Swiss, a few years ago, and now he is very experienced and the product leader at Leica Microsystems.
Hi, Theo. Thanks a lot for having me on your podcast.
I'm super happy to have you. But before we start, could you quickly introduce yourself, who you are, what you have done in your career so far?
Yes, sure. So, as you mentioned, we studied together at the same place. So, I have a background in biomedical engineering. And very quickly after my studies, I was fortunate, I would say, to be supported in the way of entrepreneurship. We had a very entrepreneurship driven school. And I've started my own venture project in the field of diagnostics. So, we had a technology for blood diagnosis that we carried out for a year. And even though the project stopped, that's where I discovered product management as a way to how to find, let's say, the synergy between technology and then usefulness for society. And that's why I carried out after the startup project my career in product management, first in another life science startup, Maxwell Biosystems in Zurich. And shortly after that, I joined Leica Microsystems, that is part of the Danner Group. So Danner is a large multinational group in diagnostics and life science. And Leica Microsystems, which is historically linked to the Leica brand, so cameras, etc., is the branch that's spin off and that focuses on microscopy. So we do microscopy for life sciences, so academia, pharma, for industry. But I work in a very niche segment of the company, which is focusing on medical devices. So we build surgical microscopes for various surgeries, and we'll be happy to talk a little bit about that. And so I've been working there for 4 years as part of the advanced microsurgery team.
Wonderful, amazing, great experience. And I want to discuss a bit the behind the scene, what happened when we prepared this podcast. I remember when we discussed, we said that we both struggle to find good information and content when it comes to product management. And all the product management information we found was mainly around tech, with the book of Marty Kagan, but also The Bold Trap from Melissa Perry, which are wonderful book, but that are book made for tech, not for medtech or health tech.
Yeah, so I fully agree. And like you, I've also read those books. And I believe that the theory of product management comes mostly from the world of tech, of startups. I'm not going to make any statement on the history of the PM job, but when you read those books, you understand that they were born from also the internet bubble. So they talk a lot about those stories of the first tech company, digital companies, the first products made out of the internet as well. And first, there is a cultural difference compared to medtech, especially I would say a European medtech hardware based company. And of course, also the products themselves are completely different. So we'll have the chance to, let's say, expand on that. But as our listeners probably know, the medtech industry is heavily regulated. It's also, especially when we talk about hardware, which is the company in which I'm working with, those are longer life cycles, also very complex product. And of course, the I would say the first point that is very different is the agility. Well, agile is a word that we hear a lot in product management theory, where you're not trying to live in your cave for ages and build a product for 5 years, and then suddenly you come out and you have it tested by the customer, but you're trying to do a very quick MVP. You're trying to also arrange teams developing the product work in a different ways to be able to more quickly separate the work and ship it to the customer. But of course, those, let's say, textbook wise, will not apply to medtech, and you need to find a way to extract the value and to apply it differently to a medical environment.
Yeah, well understood, and I think that's highlighting very well some of the complexities that we have today in medtech. But as mentioned before starting maybe on what is very complicated to apply with this kind of best practice, and as you mentioned, they really evangelize agilities and how we can roll out product very fast to iterate very fast. I would like to understand from your perspective, what did you take and what can you bring into your work today?
Maybe I could start by saying what are the best practices that will work sort of easily, right? I think then there are other best practices that still work, but that you must take sort of some workarounds. But I think that there are some base concepts in the theory of product management that really readily apply to our industry. I think the first one is really the customer centricity, which really is the life and breath of product management. So in product management, we're trying to make products, make solutions, make services, whatever it is, by really thinking about who is benefiting from it. So the customer, sometimes we will also talk about the user directly. And so the theory is trying to help us develop some empathy. So there is an emotional aspect, but also some methods to discover, to get interested in our customers, to understand how do they do their work, what are their pain points, what are their barriers, and that sort of going out of our own views, our own biases, getting to understand who is going to use our product, service, etc., is the base. And then the whole toolkit sort of is developed on this sort of more psychological principle of product management, of really trying to get from the customer point of view and having them in mind when you create value. And I believe this is something that will work in all industries and that for sure is very useful in medtech as well.
When you talk about customer centricity, I would love to understand, do you think that in our industry in general, we are not very customer focused or let's say patient focused?
That's a very good question. And I will also make some assumptions here based also of what I've seen. So at first, I would say everybody can be non-customer centric, right? So even you can work in a very tech and cool startup, and I've seen that also around me, especially when I was in the startup environment. It's not because you're small and agile and cool that you're necessarily going to be very good at implementing those very maybe forward ways of customer centricity, etc. So first thing, everybody can get it right or wrong. I think that in medtech in particular, you will have some barriers to customer centricity. I would say some of the factors are first, it's especially when I think from where I come from at Leica Microsystems. We celebrated our 175th anniversary last year. It's amazing to have such a long lasting footprint in history, but we also carry some legacy from, so a very long legacy, right? So, first, I think that companies need to be able to always update their ways of doing business and to, while respecting their legacy, being also able to push something through. Another point is that medtech is not only, when you make a product in medtech, you're not only concerned about the value, the customer satisfaction, there are also some regulatory aspects and some safety aspects as well, which are not directly related whether your customer is going to be happy or whether they're going to like that or not. And I think that, of course, it's important to take those into account, but sometimes people think that it means that, let's say, the emotional aspect, that the workflow aspect, that the ease of use aspect, all of those things that are really associated by having a more deep understanding of your customer do not apply to medtech. And I think that sometimes the length of the project, the waterfall framework, the regulatory aspect, which also takes a lot of mind space of everyone, is also the PM, is also sometimes a good excuse to forget that what you're doing in the end is making a product for a user, making a product for a customer and for patients.
And I was thinking of a couple of topics when you mentioned that. One, I think, I don't know what if you have already experienced that, is that we tend to be very regulatory and clinically biased in healthcare, which makes total sense. Don't get me wrong. But I think that sometimes also when we do that, we tend to focus on discuss with the best surgeon or the best hospital, the best doctors, the one that are trying to bring to the next level our product. And we start to forget a bit what can happen and the reality of a smaller hospital with lower budget or basically the real world. And I think this bias is also very present in our industry when we talk to super important key opinion leader, KOL, etc. And then that's one of the things that you need to be aware, and being very customer centric means that you need to talk to all your customers. And I really like also when you mentioned that there is different toolkit we need to bring into our way of working. So can you tell me more about this toolkit and what does it bring?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the toolkit as again what you will find in the textbooks about what is the toolkit of the PM or what they should know, and a little bit how it applies to medtech, right? So I think toolkits, and you anticipated my second answer in a way. I was going to say that's another thing that directly applies. Of course, and here it's again not only medtech. You will have to apply to adapt a little bit the toolkit to different industries. But I think the road mapping, the feature prioritization method. So for I don't know, like for example, Moscow, being able to write a great value proposition, understanding value proposition and how to iterate it, voice of customer in general, which are all the methods that you use to get to understand better your customers. I think all of that absolutely 100% apply to medtech. What is interesting, so maybe I can give some examples of some things that I will use and that I will not use. For example, especially in the voice of customer methodologies, it depends really on your market and also on how accessible your customers are. I think, and to also go back to what you said before, which I liked, I think customers is one thing that I find really amazing in medtech. So in our case, so we build surgical microscopes. We are B2B, so we will directly sell to institutions. And well, let's say in terms of how we build a product and the usage, the patient themselves are not going to have a big, let's say, impact into the process, right? I mean, it's a surgery, so the patient is awakened, they are not directly the user. Of course, they benefit from the product, but the expertise is also fully in the hand of the surgeons and the surgical team, right? So in the end, so we end up really talking more to doctors, to HCPs. And I think what is amazing in this field is that people are very accessible in general. I think one advantage is that you have a lot of doctors who are trying to advance the field, right? So they're here to treat patients, but they're also trying to change the status quo while not jumping on any methods because, of course, the safety of the patients are important. But here it's easy to find partners with which you're going to be able to innovate because it's easy to find this common goal of saying, yeah, we want to advance the field of medicine, so let's try and make products together. So in my experience, this has been something really wonderful, how you can connect with HCP. And I've experienced it both in the startups world, where being a small structure sometimes helps you, and also in a larger company. So I felt that regardless of the size of the company, the discussion between industry and HCPs can exist because you have this common goal. Now, to go back to the methodologies, I think that this access has also enabled me to be able to see the customer working in the field. So, being able to see how doctors work. I've had this chance. And I think this does not apply to all the industries. So, just to give an example, within our company, so we also make microscopes for industry. So for example, for pharma, they purchase microscope for either research or for their supply chain. And here, pharma, they will not just let you in and see, yeah, just come one day and see how we are using your products, right? Because they are highly secretive, etc. So I think one chance that we have in medtech is that I think our customers are accessible. Of course, the downside of that is that I think HCPs are also the contact between industry and HCPs is also regulated, of course, for good reasons, for anti-corruption mostly. So therefore, someone who would be new in medtech or who would be happy to work with doctors also need to be very aware of that. Again, I think if you're in a small structure, it helps, and you're in more sort of beginning, but as soon as you also work in a big company that also has more potential to do harm, you have to be really careful, and you need to also have a strong team over there to make sure that you remain compliant. This is, let's say, in a nutshell, the customer in medtech, at least on how I experience it in my job at Leica. And what is going, if we go back to the toolkit of the product manager, it's interesting because some methods will work and some not. So, as I said, we have the great chance to be able to see the customer work. So, what we call ethnography or being at Gemba. You can also do interviews easily, you can do surveys easily. On the other hand, for example, more large customer base like A/B testing or larger quantitative studies will be also more difficult. And if you compare it to a internet product, for example, if we take an app like Spotify, where you can get like millions of data every day from your user, which is a dream for a product manager. In medtech, especially B2B hardware based, it's very difficult for us to get data on our product. So once we sell a microscope is sold, it then becomes very difficult. Even usage data, even if it's not like sensitive data, just things on how our products are used, this is going to be extremely complicated. So you need to find some workarounds. So those are just some examples of, if we go back to the toolkit, some things that were great, at least in my hardware medtech industry, versus things that would not work.
Yeah, good. And that's maybe a perfect link with my next question. Because what we talk about so far is what can be applied. And one of the very important concepts is the continuous discovery in these books. And you mentioned that you not struggle, but it's not as easy to collect data, especially quantitative data. How do you perform discovery?
That's a very good question. So, again, to put some perspective on how then our products are done. So, in the textbook, so as we mentioned in the beginning, the lean methodology, being agile, so having to work in iterations to shipping to updating your product, that's what is being advised as best practice product management. And they say, well, if you do waterfall, you're really old dinosaurs. And then you feel bad because when you arrive in the medtech hardware industry, well, waterfall is not something that you can completely get rid of, right? So waterfall is this process where basically you're gonna cut the development of a new product into small phase. So you have maybe a first phase is conception, then you develop it, and then after that you test it. So you do the verification validation, make sure that everything is safe and works as intended, and then you can go to the launch phase and you launch your product. So how do you do product discovery? So I think I viewed it more as okay, how do we take the good practice of having something that is iterative, where you continuously learn, test, repeat, etc. I think you need to cut the elephant into small pieces. So the waterfall is what it is. You're going to have to do different things at different point. The core of doing tests and to doing discovery is de-risking. So essentially, you have an idea, you have a project, and in the end, you want to launch something real. What you're doing along the way, both R&D, product, everyone, is basically de-risking. So you're taking things that are uncertain and that could make the project a failure, and you're basically verifying if your ideas are good, changing your ideas, etc. So I think in waterfall, the key is to spread your risks along the timeline and to see what are the most important risks, so the what could potentially kill the project, that I could address at an early stage, and which ones are they. Let me give some examples. I can go through, let me go through an actual example, that one product that I've been working with at Leica. So without giving any secret, just on the how we tackled it. So we started the project, and basically we already knew the workflow of the customer and their pain points, right? So one also important thing is don't reinvent the wheel. So check your own biases, but don't reinvent the wheel. So when we started, we knew how the products used the products and where the barriers were, right? So from that we said, okay, what are so we want to do something new, something that is a bit risky. And as a matter of fact, this product, so this risky product already existed. So a competitor had already started doing this risky product. So first phase is like, is this even working? Is this even something that the customer want? So we went, and the first studies that we did is we went to customers who were using this competitor product, and we said, how does it work? Do you like it? Is it working as you want? What are the barriers, right? Answer is, that's great. I love it. It's really cool. However, of course, there is point one, two, three that could work better. Okay, so we learned that. Now we know it's a good idea. We know there is value there. Next phase, so we go from to the concept phase. So we started to build our own product concept to say, hey, that works great. So we need to make sure that we address those into this new technology. And we know that there's those issues. So let us also make some improvements there to address those pain points. Next phase is okay, let's test if this works. Does our idea address really where the value is for the customer? And so then the next phase, we went with our prototypes, etc., and we tested them with the customer and we validated, okay, yes, those ideas were good. We are indeed delivering the value as we wanted. We are bringing more than what the competitors are bringing. So it's valid to continue to move forward. And
I have
one,
two
yes.
questions here. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's like I'm getting super interested in this. First of all, I'm much more into software than hardware. What is the time frame when you do this kind of discovery? How fast can you do all that, just prototyping, etc.?
Mhm. So again, taking a step back before giving the timelines for us, I think what is going to influence your timeline is how good you are at engaging your customer base. This is super important. If you have a huge customer engagement engine, it could go really fast. And also basically at how what makes sense in terms of the development. Because if we bring customers every 2 weeks, but you don't have anything in between, then it doesn't make sense. For hardware, or at least in our case, I would say that we have done checks every 6 months. So we are trying to design a study every 6 months, and we're trying to basically see what are the risks that we can address in this study. And as much as possible, we are also trying to parallelize, right? So maybe there is, let me just give you an example. So if we know we're going to have a customer touch point every 6 months, we're also trying to see, okay, well, we have a prototype. So we need to see if the prototype, for example, is the usability risk of this prototype high or not. But we still have a positioning that is not completely finished. So I'm just going to give a random example. Is it more this type of doctors who are going to use the product, or more this type of doctors? So one important thing I would say also in the waterfall, especially if you cannot have touch points with customers on a regular base, is try to parallelize your lines of risks or things that you need to make sure to discover about the market and the customer, and try to combine whenever possible the different de-risking in those touch points.
Great. And also one assumption I have when you mentioned that is that you mainly test, I assume, ease of use, integration with the customer world, or how do you test also more clinical feature?
Can I ask you what you would mean by clinical
I mean,
in
by
this case?
something that is more in a term that, showing performance of your device, if you want to bring a new technology that is regulated, that cannot maybe be used on a clinical aspect before it has been approved by the regulator and launched, how do you de-risk a more clinical feature, something that could impact potentially the work of the HCP or the patient?
So I think that for those, at the end of the day, we don't have methodologies that would be different. I
Mhm.
think the key here is more about linking it to the regulatory structures, to also the claim framework. But let's say choosing the right methodology and implementing it still would be similar as I want to know if this is bringing satisfaction, value. I just think that the difference here is that if you're going to have it compared against standard, if you're going to have claims against it and if they need to be backed up, you just need to make sure that not only do you fulfill what makes you certain as a product manager that this is on the right way, and you need to also understand on the regulatory part what will also convince them that you can prove better efficiency or whatever clinical marker you're trying to improve. So then at this point what it becomes critical, and where I think the collaboration with regulatory functions become very important, is that you need to align on what you product manager trying to create value and prove value is important to you, and then also how does it work on the medical field. I think it's important to have a collaboration or to be very experienced as a product manager that you exactly know what needs to be tested and how.
Great, thank you. There is a second aspect that is a lot mentioned in these books, and this is everything related to the product vision. Do you have a product vision? How do you manage these parts?
Yes, that's actually a good point. And that's one point that I've been trying to experiment in my current company. It's not something that we were doing in the company before, but based on that, I wanted to bring this mostly for two reasons. So, first, to help the teams focus. That's something, of course, that every product manager faces as a challenge at some point, is that you're not going to be able to fulfill all your wishes, etc. And I think that people are looking up to you to be able to make some tough decisions and to help say, well, this is important and this is less important. So product vision is something that we've been using for the current product that I'm working on to help us focus. And I'm very happy to say that so we've developed the strategy in pillars. So we say those are the four pillars where we want to bring value. Everything else, great if we do it, but it's optional. And it's a document that we've consistently went back to during the product development. And that has also sometimes helped me make sure that I go back on track, because it's also easy to get lost in new ideas. And so, yeah, so this works a lot. And one other feature of, let's say, textbook product management that I've tried to do was the future user stories. So basically, you're writing a fake testimony of a customer who would be using your potential new products and who says, well, it was great to use this new product. I really like this and that. And I think this was also very interesting because it not only gives focus, it also gives motivation to the teams. Although for the funny part, I have to say that it was a little bit tricky because the company had never seen that. And some people, and again, this is this clash of culture between textbook PM and I would say a Medtech environment, they were afraid that we were basically starting to write claims and that we are saying, yeah, that's exactly what the product will be doing, right? While actually, this is a guide of where we want to end up. But we, of course, we don't know if we will be managing to do exactly the vision and if those testimonies will be 100% right at the end. Of course not, because that's the goal of pivoting, and product management is embracing that your final ID is never, or let's say your first idea is never the final one. So there was some explanation and also talk that I needed to do to also sometimes make this product vision pass with some of the functions. But hopefully, it's an exercise so we can make more and more frequent and that everybody sees the value behind it.
No, that's a great example. That's very funny what you mentioned because I mean, for me, when I brought it, it's a bit of a shock for certain people because it's switching the way they have to think. It goes for what do we do next? From, okay, if we want to get there, what do we have to do now? Which are not necessarily very different questions, but the way of thinking is a bit different. And yeah, as you mentioned, some people sometimes believe that, oh, is this what you want to claim? I'm like, no, not at all. We are far away from that. But I found it very strong to have a product vision to motivate the team toward a goal and also for the focus. You mentioned the focus problem, and I think it's one of the main topics, especially in big company where you have so many projects going left and right, where it's very easy to lose the focus or sometimes to realize that you drift from the initial vision or value proposition you wanted to create, which can make sense, don't get me wrong. But it's very good to be aware of it and to at least make a conscious decision to switch to a new one and not drifting just because you drift and then you try to follow the latest request from management. Also, sometimes use, let's say, the vision goal with management because this helps them to define and approve what we want, where we want to go, and to see if it's aligned with where they expect, let's say, the team department to arrive long term. And what is very funny is then sometimes when you have feature requests also of things coming from the management, and then you're like, it's actually the opposite of what you ask us to do and what you envision. It creates very interesting discussion, and they're like explaining either they can explain where it's come from now, where they see this change, which is very valuable for me as I on the product team. On the other hand, sometimes you see that they have to think back about, okay, let's see if it makes sense now or if it's just a side request. But I think in general, product vision helps a lot when it comes to focus and when it comes to engaging stakeholders and people in the product team and management.
Well, I think what you're saying about the alignment in the management team is very important. Maybe one day you will make a whole episode of podcast on that. But I think the role of product management, the ownership or like the authority of a product manager without direct report, and its relationship with the management of a company and the trust relationship of, a product manager should be able to make the decisions and should be trusted on understanding how to deliver value. But it's sometimes very difficult to create this relationship. But and as a product manager, to also have the courage to reach out to the management and to feed them regularly of what you're doing, what have been your decisions, why you think that's a good idea. And I think what you're saying about using the product vision as a way to, let's say, level with everyone and also to sort of have a handshake with some of the leadership to say, well, if we all agree to do that, then it's going to make our future discussions much easier because then it's either within the vision or it's outside.
Yeah, that's great. And that's one of the main learning I got, at least from Inspired, the book of Marty Kagan, on the importance of the vision, where you want to go. But now that the only thing I have to mention is that with this product vision alignment with stakeholders is that when you read the book and you look at your own reality, don't think you have a bad project manager. I think it's very tough to apply what he's saying, but it's very informative and at least it helped a lot. And the stakeholder engagement is so critical, especially in big organization. You need to get this stakeholder and the product engagement, which lead to at the end the empowered team that people are trying to build and to have, because this helps you to move forward and at least faster and further from my
Yes. One point I would like to mention about your comment reading a book and then thinking, but I'm a bad product manager, or our organization is really bad at product management. How are we going to do this? I think this is for sure some a trap that we should not fall into, right? Or we should not beat ourselves up. And related to medtech, since we're talking about medtech and product management, we should also not shoot at an industry and saying, well, the reason why we do bad product management is because it's medtech, right? We have regulations, we have this, we have waterfall, etc. And I think that maybe to all the product managers who are listening to us and who are despairing or think that they have a bad company, I would say my advice is to breathe and then to see how you're going to implement changes step by step. Because it's like that in all industries, right? You're never going to, probably you have very few companies that are perfect in product management and who put that in at the center of their practice. So it's okay. And I think when you read a book like that, take what you believe is the most important and try to bring it step by step into into the company. An example from my own work as a product manager at Leica, and also because it aligns with what makes me tick the most in product management, was to really, let's say, improve the customer insight process. I really love that. I think it's really the base of a very strong product management. So my mission was to say, well, I'm going to build it from the ground up. It's We're not very good at that at the moment. I really want to do that. Of course, then there are still tons of things that can be better. Even you start building something, it's not perfect. But I would say that's for me the real reunification of textbook and your actual work as a product manager is being motivated by the great product managers, the bestseller books, and bringing it step by step in what you do, growing from it. Also checking what doesn't make sense in the theory, right? We should also be critical of some theories or ideas that just are not going to work or that we don't agree with. So I think this is very important also not to be too, let's say, not to despair too much when we feel that, yeah, but how can product management even work in medtech or in my company?
And I think you're very good at making my transition, Victor. And I think we talked about what's great to bring in and what we love to bring into from those textbooks into our daily life. As a next step, I would like to better understand. There is also some different concepts that may be more difficult to integrate, especially even more in the B2B hardware product management, even more than in software product management. Can you elaborate a bit on some of the concepts that were actually tough and or maybe just don't apply properly from your perspective in our industry?
Mm. So the first that would come to mind, and it relates to what we were saying about agile. I think it's this whole idea of being able to make MVP, so minimal viable product, to make them fast, to launch them, to see if they fail or if they succeed, and then to iterately improve on them is, of course, something that you cannot do per se. Of course, it's interesting to think how MVP can still work in medtech, but let's say you cannot just make something in cardboard, launch it, see how customers like it, and then run with it. Another thing that is difficult that goes a little bit into this direction, I think this will apply to, let's say, our industry, the surgical microscope. In some other medtech companies, it will not be the case, but it's customization. So in our case, it's very difficult to customize our products because every little change makes it then is going to just launch a whole process, and because also the volumes would not justify that you would start to do just break down and have a crazy portfolio or do a customization. So that customization and the agility that cannot be really applied very easily makes it kind of sluggish and very slow for you to bring an idea to market. And that's why, going back to what we were saying before, managing your waterfall risk, and so how risk is going to be spread on waterfall, and failing fast waterfall project and see how you can make sure that you're on the right idea or you pivot your idea is key. So without launching the product, you need to try to make the MVP mindset live within your development structure. And that's why having a strong customer base for me would be key, and to be able to engage them on a very regular basis and to use those a little bit as MVP. Another thing that you can do as well is that you, again, that depends on the how mature your organization is and how much money is invested. But I think companies that invest in, for example, environment of the customer, they build up a operating room, a fake operating room, or they are trying to recreate the customer environment. Then they bring in the customer, and then they are making their prototype used on, of course, non-patient. It can be just like phantoms or any test like that. I think this is great because that brings you as close as you can to a real environment without having to launch a real product. So all the things that can bypass that can make the MVP portion work. So I would say this is the biggest thing that do not apply to the medtech.
Do you have any kind of test hospital, or I don't know how to mention that exactly, like, or some customer where you can bring in products that they will try, because I don't know exactly how microscopy working, but maybe they could try to screen and see some image or not, and just compare with something that has already been done with another microscope that is validated on the market to see if there's some progress or not. How do you ever find a way to set up this kind of environment you mentioned for the customers that is successful, or any best practice there?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure there is really a one recipe. So maybe it will be a bit of a vague answer, but I would say when you're thinking about validating your product early enough, way before launch, and you have a new idea, and you want to be as close as possible to the customer, to go back to textbook, think about all the theory about wireframes, about the fidelity of prototypes, and apply that also to the customer environment. So let me explain a little bit. You can test an ID just on a piece of paper, right? You just write the ID, or if it's a software application, you're just gonna draw a wireframe of how the software application looks like. Those, or you're gonna build something in cardboard. So those are the very low fidelity prototype. When you go closer to the end, it's going to be, then you need actually almost the final product to be done to test its performance, right? So be understand where the risk in your product is, understand what will kill the product. Is it the base idea, or do you need to go all the way to testing the performance? Understand that, so don't focus on doing something that is too advanced if that's not where the risk is. And then apply the same mindset to the customer testing environment. Do you need the device to be done on real used on real patient to know whether it works or not? If yes, then you need to do clinical trials. Would animal models be okay? Then you do preclinical, etc. But maybe there is what you're trying to see in terms of performance can be tested in another way. And in our case, we are exploring that, of course. But so I would say in our case, there is no, let's say, perfect recipe, but more and more also in our company, we're trying to see how can we perform measurement and test the performance even at a very late stage of the project on, let's say, phantoms and things that are do not require like heavy preclinical or clinical trials.
Now get understood, and I think it's much easier on the software, at least just wireframe. But also we have ability to do very high fidelity mockups as well. Clickable mockups that could be used as, let's say, a software. But as you mentioned, it's never to test performance, it's more to test usability, to test how it would integrate also in the system. I'm also a huge fan of expert group or kind of beta testers that could, in a way, try to have a look at the software, not use it in a clinical environment, but when you arrive at the later stage of your development process in software, you don't really have to build as much as for the hardware part, but you can at least provide them an early version to make sure that you are going on the right direction, because there's often a bit of discrepancy between the solution that you had in mind and you built and the one that you actually built and you deliver to the customers. And you can minimize this risk pretty easily in software. I was wondering if you had a way in hardware.
Yeah, I
Um,
guess that you're able in software, you're able also to bring the people remotely. I think there is this thing of presence. So now when it comes to testing actual prototypes and things, I believe the big advantage of the software is that you're going to be able to do it remotely. Although I'm sure, and maybe that's a question to you, would you say that sometimes you will need the physical presence of the user or the customer on site, even though they're using a software application, because you will not be able to fully get what you want from a test if you do it, for example, via, I mean, remotely?
I think it depends what you want to test again. It's always the same question. But basically, for me, being on site and seeing the customers using in a real environment your features, your software application is key. Because when you use it outside of a context, I don't know. One thing is exactly the feature you develop, but how your feature, I don't know, will integrate in the futures with the EHR of the customer. How does it integrate with the competitive software that is using later in the workflow, that is not using your piece of software? So all this kind of topic, if you just try to assess them outside of the environment, you always miss a huge part of the story. It can be tricky and a bit complicated to assess this before launch, but that's something that is very important. And for me, being on site and observing what the customer is doing and how he is using your features and your development is one of the key learning aspects. And I would not believe that I could do properly my job if never going on site. When it comes to certain performance
Mhm.
features on that regard, then I don't necessarily need to go on site. I can have some stats. I can have some. We have also, for instance, some internal team of people that are checking and evaluating the medical team, the outcome. We have the study, the clinical studies that we can run to assess the performance. But anyway, most of the time have to do before launching the product. So that's not
Mhm.
necessarily the part. I would say for performance and clinical features, I don't necessarily need, but I do mainly studies. For what is more usability, integration of the customer environment, then I think it's on site mainly, but often it needs to be fully released to really see the reality of it. Otherwise, you try to use as good discovery technique as you can, but it's not always easy to discover before.
So one more thing I wanted to also comment based on this discussion about hardware software testing. A good hack is, especially when you work with healthcare professionals, or it applies actually to other industries, is to leverage conferences. I think that conferences are a great way to also, you have a big group of your potential customers at one site, and you can also use them to test things, to have several users. And that's something that we also have done in our company. And also it's quite, for us it's quite relevant because our customers are surgeons, and typically they are quite busy, their time is quite scarce. So conferences are always a moment where our users are sort of open, they're here to see new things, they're here also to, they're exactly in the right mindset, and they have the time available for those things. So that's sometimes a great hack if you need to have access to a lot of customers in one go.
No, that's good. Good tips. And I think one of the main goal of this episode is to define if there is some advice that you could provide to the product clinic community on how do you adapt to the medtech constraint. In a nutshell, how do you adapt to the best practice and what are the best practices that you have developed over time?
I would say that this cutting down the risk along your timeline, as I have mentioned earlier, is very important. Check what are your biggest risks and which ones you can de risk now. So instead of doing this fast agility where you're trying to launch the product as soon as you can, ask the difficult questions early and address them early and understand where you're getting value from the customer at which part of the process. I will just again say the example. So, first, you want to understand the workflow and needs. If you don't understand the medical workflow, why would you go and test some prototypes? So, first understand their environment, who they are, what they are trying to do, what are their pain points, where are the barriers, what other tools they are using, and then go with your IDs, test prototypes. And maybe the third stage is once your concept is more or less finalized, you do your design freeze because that's needed. You need to try to get the final concept as soon as possible so you can then develop and test. And then use those last phases to refine the messaging, maybe more into the marketing part of it. So you know what you have done as value, work on the value proposition, work on the messaging, see how you're going to then show that value to the customer. So that is an example of how you take the elephant of customer discovery, market understanding, and you divide it. So I would say that's the first one. Two other advices I would have, maybe that would be at a more high level. So if you have a director or some sort of overview on the whole product portfolio and also management of innovation, I would say try to create a bubble for research and innovation that works on a different regime as the product launches. So once we start a product, then it's going to be on this waterfall product development, and then you need to be fast, right? You need to do this de-risking. You need to make sure it passes the toll gates. But we know that the best ideas and the innovations, even the incremental innovations, they also happen when you give some freedom, some time, and when you can live a little bit more this agile test, measure, repeat. And I think that having some sort of innovation engine in an organization where you can make experiments and iterate fast and you have new ideas, you kill the ideas fast, you make new projects, something that really is oxygenated and that runs fast. And to link that to your actual product roadmap, portfolio, etc., I think is great. It's very difficult, but I think this is a way where you break the curse of medtech, where it's you're stuck for years working on a product that you cannot change anymore. It's very difficult to iterate, to be agile. So it's to try to also bring this innovation that constantly give you, like, populate your funnel of innovations that have been tested already, that you can then link to your more waterfall development. So I think this may be at a high level, not at the direct product manager level, but product head of product or director. I think it's a great takeaway on how to adapt best practices to medtech.
Amazing, amazing. And we are slowly arriving at the end of this podcast. Thanks a lot for everybody listening, and thanks a lot, Victor. And my last question is really, if you could give one piece of advice to a PM entering the medtech world today, if you're coming from tech, if you are coming from marketing or somewhere, what would it be?
So I think I'm gonna repeat the advice that I gave earlier. So I would say the one advice I would give is to arrive in the organization where you're working to apply the best practices step by step, to understand what resonates in the product management best practices with you, what you like to do, and to try to improve the product capability of your organization step by step, and be very open about how other departments work, what are the specificity of your industry. So if it's medtech, it's going to be regulatory, it's going to be the processes, it's going to be the internal quality management system. And instead of seeing them as barriers, see how you can work within them, and see how you can adapt and make your own best practices and go step by step.
Thanks a lot, Victor. Thanks a lot. We are very happy now to close this episode with you. I hope you enjoyed a lot. It was very informative for me, not coming from the hardware world. You are currently still working for
Yes.
Danae at Leica Microsystem. So if everybody wants to find you, maybe they can find you also on LinkedIn, right?
Exactly. I was going to say, if you want to connect, just reach out to me on LinkedIn, Victor Steininger. There are only two of us, so you will probably find the right one.
All right, amazing. And thank you again for everybody for listening to this full episode of the Product Clinic podcast. Don't hesitate to share, but also give us a like if you enjoyed the episode. And I'm looking forward to having you in the next episode very soon. Have a great end of the day.